Have you ever wondered how close we've come to the world's last day? Let's take a journey back in time, to a period where the hands of a metaphorical clock, ominously named the doomsday clock, were just a tick away from midnight. This symbolic timekeeper, maintained by the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, serves as a chilling reminder of how close humanity has come to self-destruction, with midnight representing global catastrophe. Now imagine the year is 1962. The world is in the throes of the Cold War, a time of political tension and arms race between two global superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. It's during this year that the doomsday clock rids 7 minutes to midnight. Why, you may ask? The answer lies in a 13-day period that would go down in history as the Cuban Missile Crisis. The crisis began when the Soviet Union, in a move considered by the United States as an aggressive declaration of war, sent nuclear missiles to Cuba. This act was not just a mere display of power, it was a palpable threat, a clear and present danger to America, as Cuba was and still is, essentially in the backyard of the American border. The world watched, hearts pounding, as the two superpowers stood toe-to-toe, their fingers hovering over the trigger of nuclear war. The gravity of the situation was such that every decision, every move had the potential to tip the balance, to bring about the world's last day. The doomsday clock, a constant reminder of our vulnerability, ticked ominously closer to midnight. The world, caught in the crossfire of this political standoff, held its breath, each second, each minute echoing the ticking of that dreadful clock. This was the moment when the world held its breath for 13 days, as the threat of nuclear war loomed large. What could have triggered such a potential global catastrophe? The Cuban Missile Crisis. In the early 60s, the world was in the throes of the Cold War, a tense standoff between the Soviet Union and the United States. The epicenter of this standoff? A small island nation just 90 miles off the coast of Florida, Cuba. Cuba became a Soviet ally when Fidel Castro overthrew the US-backed Batista regime in 1959. This shift in power was a cause for concern for the United States, but it was the Soviet Union's next move that escalated the situation to a crisis. Under the leadership of Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet Union made the decision to send nuclear missiles to Cuba. You might ask, why would the Soviets do something so provocative? The answer lies in the strategic significance of Cuba's location. Placing nuclear missiles in Cuba would give the Soviets a first-strike capability against the United States. This move was a direct response to the United States placing nuclear missiles in Turkey, within striking distance of the Soviet Union. The discovery of these missiles by the United States in October 1962 set off a series of events that brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. President John F. Kennedy and his advisors grappled with how to respond. Should they launch a full-scale invasion of Cuba, or should they opt for a more diplomatic approach? As they debated, the world watched, holding its breath. This was not just a political chess game between two superpowers, it was a moment where the fate of the world hung in the balance. The tension was palpable. The stakes were high. The decisions made during this time would determine whether the world would continue to spin or come to a catastrophic halt. And so the world watched, anxiously waiting for the next move. For 13 days the world was on the edge of its seat. The year was 1962, and the contesting giants were none other than the United States and the Soviet Union. It was a high-stakes game of chess with nuclear weapons. The Cuban Missile Crisis had kicked into high gear. The United States, led by President Kennedy, responded to the Soviet Union's audacious move of placing nuclear missiles in Cuba with a naval blockade. This blockade was no ordinary one. It was a ring of steel and firepower, a stern message to the Soviets that America would not let these missiles become operational. Behind the scenes, a frantic exchange of communications ensued between President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev. The world waited, breath held, as the two superpowers teetered on the brink of nuclear war. The days were long, the nights longer, the waiting was agonizing. Each morning brought no resolution, only mounting tension. The global doomsday clock was ticking, reaching a chilling 7 minutes to midnight. The prospect of a nuclear holocaust seemed all too real. The fate of millions hung in the balance, swinging between the decisions of two men. Throughout the 13 days, the world watched, prayed, and hoped. Hopes for peace, for a resolution that didn't involve mushroom clouds and nuclear winter. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a deadly embrace, their fingers hovering over the trigger. Each day was a new chapter in this nerve-wracking saga. The clock ticked, the world watched, and the leaders deliberated. The 13 days seemed like an eternity, a stretch of time that held the world captive in a vice of fear and uncertainty. And then, on the 13th day, a glimmer of hope, a possibility of resolution. The world exhaled a collective sigh of relief, but the tension still hung heavy in the air. Would this standoff end peacefully, or would the world be plunged into nuclear war? Finally, after nearly 2 weeks of fear and uncertainty, the crisis was resolved. The resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis was a sigh of relief for the entire world. On the precipice of a nuclear war, the Earth stood still, all eyes watching the tense dance between the two superpowers. It was a dance that could have ended in a catastrophic crescendo, but instead, it ended with a silent whisper of diplomacy. The Soviet Union, under the leadership of Nikita Khrushchev, agreed to dismantle and remove its nuclear missiles from Cuba. This agreement, however, didn't come without its own price. In exchange, the United States, led by President John F. Kennedy, pledged not to invade Cuba. Not known to many at the time, there was also a secret agreement that the US would dismantle its own missile sites in Turkey, a decision that was kept under wraps for many years to come. The crisis resolution marked a defining moment in the Cold War, a moment where both superpowers realized the dire consequences of their actions. They had peered over the edge of the abyss, and neither liked what they saw. It was a sobering reminder of the destructive power they held and the responsibility that came with it. In the aftermath, the crisis sparked significant changes in global politics. It led to the establishment of a direct communication link between the US and the Soviet Union, known as the Hotline, to avoid such crises in the future. It also led to the signing of the Limited Test Ban Treaty in 1963, marking the first agreement to regulate nuclear weapons. The Cuban Missile Crisis served as a grim reminder of the destructive potential of nuclear war. It was a wake-up call for the world, a call that led to diplomatic efforts to prevent such a crisis from happening again. The world held its breath for 13 days in 1962, days that felt like an eternity. But when the final sigh of relief was exhaled, it was a sigh heard around the globe, a sigh that marked the end of the world's closest brush with nuclear annihilation. In the end, the world stepped back from the brink of nuclear war. The Cuban Missile Crisis taught us some valuable lessons. And as we delve into these learnings, we see how they apply not just to the world of international diplomacy, but to our everyday lives as well. Firstly, the crisis underscored the importance of communication. Throughout those 13 days, the Soviet Union and the United States were in constant dialogue, despite their differences. It was this open line of communication that helped both sides understand each other's perspectives and ultimately find a peaceful resolution. In our own lives, we must remember that dialogue, even with those we disagree with, is crucial in resolving conflicts. Secondly, the crisis highlighted the value of diplomacy. As the world teetered on the brink of nuclear war, it was diplomatic negotiations that saved the day. The art of diplomacy, of finding common ground and striking a balance between different interests, is vital not only in international relations, but in our personal interactions as well. Thirdly, the crisis showed us the need for nuclear disarmament. The presence of nuclear weapons in Cuba brought the world to the brink of destruction. This served as a stark reminder of the devastating power of nuclear weapons and the need to control their proliferation. Today, as nations continue to possess and develop these weapons, we must advocate for their reduction and eventual elimination. Lastly, the crisis taught us the importance of leadership. During those 13 days, the world looked to the leaders of the United States and the Soviet Union for direction. Their decisions, made under immense pressure, ultimately averted a catastrophe. This lesson is a reminder that good leadership is key in navigating crises, both large and small. As we look back on the Cuban Missile Crisis, we are reminded of how close we came to the world's last day, and the lessons we must remember to prevent such a crisis in the future.